Hello everyone and welcome to our new video. In this video, we are basically going to understand about the Dockershim removal by the Kubernetes in the version 1.24. So starting with the Kubernetes version 1.24, you will not be able to install the Docker directly using the Dockershim, which was the default process up till now. And we are basically going to look where this Dockershim fits into the picture, how basically removing the Dockershim affects you in installing and managing the Docker containers over the Kubernetes, and how this can be mitigated using the CRI pluggable system, which is the one which is Kubernetes is supporting now. So we are going to understand about why Kubernetes has done it, the reason behind it, the advantages of it, the disadvantages of it, and why you will need to upgrade at a point in time, because the further development in the Kubernetes is going to be done using the CRI pluggable system. So you need to clearly understand about the changes, because these are the breaking changes. And if you are running any Kubernetes cluster for your workload, you will eventually have to upgrade the cluster now to a later version, because all the future releases of the Kubernetes with extra functionality, bugs removal, all these things will be supported with the new CRI pluggable systems. Okay, so very first thing, let's understand what is this Dockershim removal all about. So starting with the Kubernetes version 1.24, now Kubernetes has uh, announced this, and this is finalized, and they have also committed this, that they are not going to support the legacy feature of which was the Dockershim. And now if Dockershim was the container runtime, okay, for the Kubernetes, but it has been superseded, that is, it has been replaced now with the CRI pluggable system. Now that the Dockershim has been removed, many developers and the cluster administrators will have to go through the inconvenient but the necessary migration, which is now compulsory. You cannot avoid this going forward. So let's understand, there are two parts here. We are going to understand what is CRI. Then we are going to understand why Dockershim was deprecated, and we are going to understand from a diagram like how the CRI basically allows the Kubernetes to do the deployment, like managing the Kubernetes cluster with much better way after the removal of the Dockershim. So let's first understand what is the CRI, that is your container runtimes. Now, whenever you are going to run a pod inside a Kubernetes, you need a container runtime to run the pods inside the Kubernetes. So what this means is that you need to install a container runtime. Previously, the container runtime was the Docker. So you were directly installing the Docker engine on all the Kubernetes nodes, and once you install the Docker engine, then you were able to install the Kubernetes, and the Kubernetes master components were running on the Docker containers, and this is how the Kubernetes cluster was originally run. Okay, now with the container runtime interface, basically a plugin interface which enables the kubelet to use a wide variety of container runtimes without the need to recompile. What this means is that it basically, this container runtime is kind of a plugin which basically the kubelet. Now what is kubelet? Kubelet basically allows help in deploying the helps the scheduler to schedule the pods onto the newer worker nodes when they get deployed, and eventually it communicates through API proxy to the etcd and makes an entry about all the pod into the etcd. That's how basically Kubernetes knows where the pod is being running. Now basically this CRI allows the kubelet to run with the container runtime. So it was bounded with the kubelet, and you don't need to recompile it again. Okay. Now CRI for the Docker. Okay. We are specifically only talking here about the case of the Docker, because there are other container technologies as well, like Rocket, Mirantis. We are not talking about them because they were separate, right? They are not affected because of this change, but the major ones which all major organizations are using, that is the Docker, to run their application workload, is currently will be affected. So basically the CRI for the Docker was Dockershim. So this is what Dockershim is. That is, it is allowing you to run the Docker container. Now I will explain you this with a diagram as well, because Docker is not directly supported. That is, Docker is not compatible directly with the Kubernetes. So this Dockershim was introduced in between. Is currently the built-in container runtime on the kubelet code base. What this means is that it is run with the kubelet. So you were whenever you were working on the Kubernetes, this Dockershim was coming into the picture. It allows the communication, and this was basically interacting and it was running along with the kubelet. Now there was a tight coupling between the Dockershim and the kubelet, and that's how you were running the workload up till now. Now Kubernetes 1.24 requires you to use a runtime that conforms to with the container runtime interface, that is CRI. So what are the available container runtimes with the Kubernetes? There is like containerd, CRIO, Docker engine. This is the one which has been affected now. Mirantis, container runtime, and Rocket. So these are the major container runtime which are available with the Kubernetes. Now, what exactly is Dockershim, and why is it deprecated, and why this is such a big thing? So Dockershim is a CRI compliant layer between the kubelet and the Docker daemon. So as I told you, it is not able to directly communicate. Basically, all the communication was being done through the Dockershim, as shown in the screen picture below. If you see here, the kubelet is using the Dockershim, okay, as a CRI to interact with the Docker engine, and that's how basically your container, it interacts with the container, and all your containers were getting deployed. Now, maintaining the Dockershim was a heavy burden on the Kubernetes maintainers, because the CRI standards was created to reduce the burdens, right? So there was already a newer technology which basically was created to reduce this burden of maintaining the Dockershim specifically for the Docker container. Now think from a Kubernetes perspective that there are multiple container technologies that the Kubernetes has to support, not only the Docker, but the other container technologies as well. Now they are using the CRI, which is much better, because it is not something you are specifically doing just for one type of container. It is like CRI was a standard, right? So it reduces the overall burden for maintaining the interoperability between the different container runtimes. Docker itself doesn't currently implement the CRI. This was the problem. Okay, that is, Docker didn't opt it for the CRI, which was a standard for creating the containers and allowing it to reduce the burden, right? So this was not supported by the Docker. That's why for a temporary solution, the Kubernetes implemented this Dockershim, which allows the Docker to be running inside the Kubernetes. Now, Dockershim was always a temporary solution that you need to understand, because that's what the name shim represents in the Dockershim. That is, it's a temporary solution by the Kubernetes to run the Docker containers inside the Kubernetes. But this was never meant to be like a permanent solution. That is why they have actually removed it, and this is having the advantages for the Kubernetes as well, and for you as the user as well, that we are going to discuss in a while. Now additionally, features that were largely incompatible with the Dockershim was the C groups version 2. So that is why you were not able to upgrade to the newer version of the C groups and the user namespaces that are being implemented with the newer CRI runtime. So this is another thing which the Kubernetes 1.24 will be having. That is, once you implement the CRI separately, and then you will be able to use the C groups version 2 and the namespaces, which are having the additional advantages. That is why you were not able to move ahead, because you were restricted by this Dockership. Okay, now removing the support for the Dockershim will allow the further development in these areas. That is what Kubernetes has to say about this, and this is how it is standardizing all the things and going to run it ahead in the Kubernetes cluster. Now, Mirantis and Docker, they have committed to maintaining the Dockershim after it got removed from the Kubernetes. Now, these are the two different companies. Now, Docker is already maintaining the Docker containers and the Mirantis. So they are saying that they are going to maintain the Dockershim and look after it further development. But then this is something which has been removed from the Kubernetes for now. Now let's try and understand this, how this basically works. So if you look here, basically there is a kubelet. Now kubelet, we all understand that kubelet is going to note and it is going to update about the container. So this becomes prime importance. That is how you are going to run the containers on the worker node. Now kubelet is interacting with your CRI, that is your container runtime interface. And now if you look in this diagram, basically all the other container technology like container D, CRIO, Rocket, all these were able to implement the CRI, which is a standard. So this is like a separate layer. Now there is no bonding between them, so it is not tightly coupled. It is not something you are doing specifically for each container technology. This is a standard. Once you implement it, it will be working for your container technology. But in case of Docker, there was a Dockershim in between, which was actually doing this work. So what Kubernetes has done is that it has removed this Dockershim from between, and it is now saying that you need to use this container runtime only if you want to run your Docker container. So this is how the Kubernetes is going to support the Docker in the future releases. So this is one time change that you will have to go. Now, what is the motivation behind removing the CRI? So if you look in the Kubernetes, the CRI interface that we used to talk was a container runtime. Now, the design of the CRI is able to run a CRI implementation as a separate binary. However, if you look at the CRI for the Docker, it was a part of a kubelet code and it runs as a kubelet and is tightly coupled with the kubelet's lifecycle. So this is where the problem was coming, that if your kubelet got affected because the CRI was heavily coupled with the kubelet, so your containers like the CRI also got affected and in turn the container. So this is why they wanted to decouple it and make it much more sustainable, because Kubernetes does not prefer the tight coupling. It goes for a loose coupling. Now this is not ideal, as kubelet then has a dependency on the specific container runtime, which leads to the maintenance burden for not only for the developers in the SIG mode, so but also the cluster administrators when critical issues like some CV happens in the container runtime. So this also affected the overall security. Now, because if a CV vulnerability was induced inside the container runtime, you will find that it was affecting the cluster administrators, because this was tightly coupled, right? So if a container runtime is going to have a vulnerability, the Kubernetes will also face that vulnerability because of a tight coupling. And also the developers will have to go ahead and look for the SIG node, and they were also going to be resulting in the maintenance of this. So this also affected, right? So this is something where the tight coupling affected the Kubernetes cluster as a whole because of an external tool which was additionally added to make the Docker containers work, right? Now, what are the advantages of removing the Dockershim? So Docker is not special and should be just a CRI implementation, just like every other CRI implementation in the ecosystem. What this means is that Kubernetes wants that the Docker should be running just like the other container technologies are. So if you look at this diagram here, I have clearly shown that all the other container technologies were able to run with the CRI. Just that the Docker itself required the Dockershim. So there was some additional configuration which was running for the Docker, that is your Dockershim, which was actually handling all this communication. So it was kind of a broker in between which was causing this, and this was specifically maintained. This was reducing, like you cannot adopt the C groups, the v2 version, the namespaces, right? So again, this is where the Kubernetes is saying that if you wanted to run the Docker inside the Kubernetes, you just have to run like the other container technologies they do. So it is at par with the other container technologies now. And once you install CRI, you should be able to run it just like any other container technology. Now, currently, Dockershim enjoys some inconsistent integrations for the various reasons. removing these features should eliminate the maintenance burden for the kubelet, right? So going ahead, they are not going to maintain it because they have removed the Dockershim, right? So they are not going to maintain this specifically for the kubelet, and now they are it is much more inclined with the other container technologies, and they can focus on that side. Now a CRI Docker D can be maintained independently by folks who are interested in keeping this functionality. So they have still left a part there. So that is, you can directly implement the CRI Docker D inside your cluster. If you want to keep this functionality of the Dockershim, this can still be supported, but this is going to require the extra configuration now on, and by default the Kubernetes is not going to come with it. Previously all the versions of the Kubernetes has this built in, so you don't have to do any extra step. So this is where the things goes into the blocking state. Now over time we can remove the vendor Docker dependencies in the kubelet. They are going to remove the Docker dependencies which were tightly coupled into the kubelet. For now they have just made more use of workaround and removed it, but eventually when the everyone is going to upgrade and they are going to come with it, they are soon going to remove these Docker dependencies from the kubelet as well. Now due to the convenience of inheriting from this built-in shim for the container runtime, there is less incentive to move to new container runtimes, right? Because this is, see, this is one thing, that is, once you install the Kubernetes, your containers were working. Now when your containers were working, then no one was actually interested in moving away from it, although this was a temporary solution. But then there was no incentive, right? You are not going to do a work because your work is still getting it done, right? So they have to took a strong decision at a point in time, and they will have to forcefully do it. Right now the users don't have any option. They will eventually have to upgrade their Kubernetes cluster and make the container technologies work with the newer version, and that is how this Dockershim will eventually be removed. The production issues found and addressed in both the container D and CRIO might cause the production issues from some users, which causes a lot of maintenance burdens on the Kubernetes community. So this is what they were expecting. That is, they were actually receiving, that is, they were getting the production issues from the users, which were like doing the maintenance burden for the Kubernetes community, and they were involved, right, in order to resolve it, because there was some extra component which was just using the Docker, right? And if this is like you are facing a bug, right, during the Kubernetes running your Docker container, so you will be reaching out to the Kubernetes community, and they were actually employing this workarounds to get it, make it work, right? So this was like a overhead for them. They have to do it separately for the Docker containers, and because of that you have to maintain two different technology stacks, right? So that is why they have integrated like a simple one thing. Now all the container technologies are going to use CRI, so eventually the CRI is going to further develop, and this is also going to reduce this the issues that was being raised into the Kubernetes community by the users running the Docker with the Dockershim, and this is going to be much forward inclined, and this will be optimized going ahead. The community can focus and move faster with the newer container runtimes and relate enhancement once we drop the Dockershim. So they have decided this, that they are going to speed the development work. They are going to come up with a much more faster way of running the newer container runtimes with the new container runtimes, and eventually they will drop this Dockershim because this was like an overhead for them moving ahead, right? So this has been removed now. And what are the disadvantages of removing the Dockershim? So the deployment pain with the new library binary in addition to the kubelet. So you will have to additionally get this deployment for the CRI done, and additional component may aggregate the complexity. Currently it may be relieved with the Docker versions evolution. The number of affected users may be large because already very large number of organizations have adopted the Kubernetes. Now they have brought on a breaking change, which was obviously a temporary change, but no one actually paid much attention to it since the things were running. But now they will have to upgrade, and this is where the large number of users are going to be affected. Users must change the existing use experience when using the Kubernetes and Docker, and users have to change their existing workflows to adapt to this new changes and other unrecorded stuff. So they will have to going ahead, they will have to deploy it, they will have to work with the CRI, and that is where they are, that is where the future development is going to happen. They will be facing some changes, challenges, and there might be some bugs and errors because of this, because you are removing the Dockershim, and it is having some you can say legacy integrations. Now those kind of things will eventually have to be taken, and applications have to be running on the CRI. But going ahead, this will get it to the advantage. This is like a short-term pain you are taking in order to gain the maximum advantages. Now CRI is technically in alpha. This is another disadvantage. So CRI, the technology that the Kubernetes is now relying on, in order, after removing the Dockershim, it is still in alpha, but it will be graduating to the GA before removing the Dockershim to the kubelet. So that is what the current state of the CRI is. So overall, the CRI itself might not be that much, you can say, it is not that much stable, but then eventually it will be moving to the GA, which is at least more stable than the alpha one. And next is CRI Dockerd will vendor the Kubernetes, and that may be tough. So this is another thing, that the Dockerd, if you try to maintain the current way that you run the Docker, that will be a little bit more difficult and tough to maintain. So CRI Dockerd is an independent software running on the node and should be allocated enough resources to guarantee its availability. So that is another thing. So you will have to because it's an independent resource, so it will be consuming your resources like your CPU, memory, from the system, right? So you will have to allocate those enough resources to your server in order to run this extra component of the CRI Dockerd. So this is the another disadvantage. So considering that you will be having, like, eventually what I believe is that these disadvantages will keep reducing as more development shift towards the CRI, and overall the Kubernetes is going to gain the advantage. They will not have to look into something like legacy as something like the Dockershim. Eventually this will be like a shorter term. You will be having some challenges, you will be coming up with this errors, but eventually over a period of time all this are going to be solved, and the Kubernetes will be evolving much further with that. So that's all for this video. If you like it, please do share it with others, and please do subscribe to our channels in order to receive such kind of videos directly in your inbox. This is part 1 where we have described about the Dockershim removal from the Kubernetes. In the further parts, we are again going to discuss about the further advancement, further changes that you can expect in the Kubernetes. Now we are actually taking this in more detail just to make people understand. Most of the people, when they read about these changes, they might not be fully aware about the Dockershim, and also that's why we are touching base on this, so to go into detail and understand what and how it affects you as a user when you run the Kubernetes cluster. So that's all for this video, and do subscribe to our channel. And this is Ankit Mittal signing off. See you in next video.